I'm going to tell you about the worst week of my life. I was in my early 40s and at the pinnacle of my career, or at least what I thought was the pinnacle of my career. I was an associate pastor of a church of nearly 3,000 adults. I preached 30 to 40% of the time. I oversaw most of the major areas of the church organization and served on the senior leadership board. I fully expected to assume the powerful role of celebrity pastor. Alongside my wife of 20 years and my 3 young daughters, we were living the idyllic life. I was still young, but by the standards I had set for myself, I was successful. I was having an impact. I was a powerful man until the day I got fired. My house was nearly 30 minutes from the church office, but to this day, I have no memory of the drive home after I was fired. The only thing I can remember was the startled look on my wife's face when I walked in the door just before noon. I told her what had just happened, and she, like me, just stood there in shock. I sat on the couch, and the tears came, heaving, sobbing tears of sadness and loss. And then after the tears came a kind of rage that makes a man want to break things, throw things, hit things. But the tears had taken their toll on me, and I had no strength. I was spent. Thankfully, my kids were at school, so they didn't have to see me like that. Eventually, I walked outside to my driveway, and I prayed one of the most honest prayers I've ever prayed. I said, God, if this is ministry, to hell with this shit. Amen. I remembered back to the last staff member who was let go from this church. He had been seen coming out of a strip club, and rumors about him were rampant. And I didn't want that for me or my family. So the last thing I asked was that the church make a public statement about my firing to avoid any speculation. But in a final blow, they denied my request. They said, you're overreacting. After that, they bought my silence with a severance agreement that also functioned as a gag order, and I felt compelled to sign it. I had a mortgage and a young family depending on me, so I had no choice. And soon enough after that, the rumors started. People thought I got fired because I had had an affair. So there I was, blindsided, stripped of my income and ripped from my community. One day I belonged to something I thought was full of meaning and purpose, and the next day I was an unemployed pastor, socially exiled from nearly every relationship, every point of human connection, and every place of belonging. All of my ambition, my competence, my sense of identity as a man, all of my power, all of it was gone. And in its place was a tearful pile of emasculated humiliation. But at least I still had my health. What remained intact was my identity as a physically strong and healthy man. I'd been an all-star college football player and had stayed in great shape, but still the waves of tears and rage became a more or less daily occurrence during the next season of my life. But the solitude that I found from running in the mountains was really my only reprieve, and I did that a lot. Until the day I tore a tendon deep in my right hip. I didn't know it then, but the injury would be the beginning of a 10-year odyssey of chronic, debilitating pain as both hips deteriorated past the point of repair. What I thought was the worst week of my life snowballed into the worst decade of my life. Before I turned 50, I had had both hips replaced with very invasive and painful surgeries. Before and after the surgeries, I struggled some days even to walk. I could barely climb a flight of stairs or bend over and tie my shoes. I remember shuffling around the grocery store, leaning heavily on the shopping cart, like a man in his 90s, not a man in his 40s. And in order to cope with the pain, I consumed inappropriate amounts of just about any prescription pain medication you can think of. Think back on that time, mostly I was trying to just get through each day without a complete meltdown. My sense of identity as a man had been shattered. I was still a man, but from my perspective then, I was a weak man. Like most of my peers, I inherited a masculine mythology that taught me that men were supposed to be leaders of the home and providers of the family, strong men. I provided very little for my family during this season, though. And while my wife had always worked, most of it was part-time to allow her the freedom and flexibility to provide care for our kids and to augment my income. But now, with me in my early 40s, unemployed and barely able to walk, she became the sole breadwinner. She led me and our family with love and wisdom through this season, and we're better for it. I'm better for it. I know that now, but then it was a different story. The end of this long season of what feels like masculine exile was ironic in profound, life-changing, and humorous ways that I'm only now beginning to understand. You see, in between my first and second hip replacements, I'd begun to hear more and more about this thing called sex trafficking. So I began to research the issue and attend any event or meeting I could get into that would help me more fully understand the issue. What was immediately apparent was that men created the problem of sexual exploitation, of sex trafficking, and the problem wouldn't be solved unless better men somehow showed up to help. That much was clear, but what wasn't so clear was what exactly we should do. And looking back, I'm beginning to realize that while my motives to get involved were valid, they weren't exactly pure. Yeah, it's true that I wanted to help stop the exploitation of vulnerable people, which is a good and just reason for getting involved. But I've realized that by doing so, I was also trying to resurrect my shattered sense of masculinity. Eventually, though, this testosterone-fueled hubris that I was experiencing also began to be questioned by the very people I was trying to help. There's probably a more honest way to tell this part of the story, though. I'd begun to meet with and work with women who were trafficked as children and were now adult activists, and they began to call out my duplicity, and ironically begun to lead me on a journey that would help me not recover a lost sense of masculinity by enabling me to act out some superhero fantasy, but through their suffering, their lived experience, their feminine wisdom, they gave me a fuller and richer vision of the kind of man I needed to become. A man who did not base his value on career success or athletic capabilities, but on characteristics like humility, empathy, meekness, and appetite for justice. And they stood by me with patience and way more grace than I deserved as I struggled to grow. The beautiful irony of the worst season of my life is that the women that I set out to rescue actually rescued me. They rescued me from a burdensome, deceptive, and damaging masculine paradigm that kept me broken and in pain for over a decade. They rescued me from the tyranny of poisonous masculinity that tricked me into believing that power, aggression, and control were the only things of value I had to bring to the world. The irony of my journey into the anti-trafficking movement was that the very women who suffered the most at the hands of powerful men were the ones who taught me that what I was really missing as a man was not power, but strength. And in 100 ways that still amaze me, they've been kind and wise enough to help me gain that strength.